to the binding. So as you know, I have all this fabric in here, so I picked out my binding. I like striped binding, as you know. So last night, I was looking at my bindings, and I came in and I thought, well, I do love my striped bindings. So I went and I thought, I'm going to pick out this green and white. I auditioned it around the side of my quilt, which I do. This 1/4 of an inch or a 1/3 of an inch makes, or whatever it is, 3/8 of an inch, makes such an incredible difference. It really does. You're binding, you're thinking that little tiny thing around the edge. Think about it, because it really, really, really does make a difference. So I really like the green and white stripe. Like, my quilt needs a lot more movement, right? Because striped bindings lifted and are whimsical and almost clownish, which I quite love on a quilt, to take away the seriousness sometimes, to add a little bit of happy around the edges. So I auditioned my green and white, and I thought, oh, I like that, because it's like a grass green, and it picks up this grass green here. So I made all my binding. I cut and I made all my binding. And Elliot came in. And Elliot's like, is that your binding? I'm like, yeah. He goes, nah, that doesn't look right. I'm like, I'll go away. No, he's so good. He says, you need black and white, Mom. So I got black and white stripe. I said, what, black and white stripe, right? So we got black and white stripe, and I'm auditioning in it, and all I have, I went shopping, and I found this black and white stripe, and, oh, let me see if I can do this. I haven't made it yet. And it was a wider black and white stripe, whatever, however this goes. It was a wider black and white stripe, and as I stood away, I like that. I like it. I think he's right. He said you want to ground it with more of a neutral, which is the black or the white, but you don't really want to put white on a binding. You can on a quilt. You can. But I love the stripe. I love the stripe. It just adds that. This is a very, very bright, colorful, incredibly busy quilt. But I like it. I added a little bit more busy. So there's my black and white stripe. He came in and he's like, oh, you don't have the thinner black and white stripe. I said, this is all I have. Do you believe it? 10 million yards of fabric, and I don't have thinner. And he said, no, that'll go. So anyway, so here I am making my binding. I'm going to do the binding. I won't bore you, but I will bore you with how I do it. As you know, I do my binding. I have my binding, this one laid on my table, and I always do my binding this way. And on this angle here. I don't know what that angle is. And 90 degrees here, or 45 degrees. I don't know what that angle is. You know, that angle there. So then I would sew from this point to that point on the diagonal, and then you lift it up and you have a whole nice piece of binding like that, which it makes the seam not a lump. It makes the seam go this way and that way along your binding. Well, on a stripe, there is a way I could sit here and mess about to try to get this angle of the stripe, right? Turning it, and I can't be bothered. So on this quilt, I'm going to have little tiny lumps around the edge of my quilt. And it's not a lump. You press it real well, it's fine. But when you do the seam on the angle, the bias, what's that word I'm trying to use? What's that word, Jean? It's you make it go one way or the other. I don't know. Anyway, so when you're doing a stripe, you put of course, the right sides together, and you put the black on the top next to the black on the bottom. And that way, you will always have the pattern. Oh, and I always backstitch a little bit on my bindings. I wonder why I do that. I'm asking myself a lot of questions, and I don't know the answers. Why do I do that? That's funny. Yeah, see? Can you see where that seam is? No. So anyway, that's that. I'm going to finish up my binding. I'm going to sew all these together. I'm going to have a black and white stripe binding. and I will be done my quilt. Oh, yeah, I curved my seam. I curved my corners. People who don't like curved corners, tough. I curved my corners. I like my curved corners on my quilts. Even an angular quilt like this, I like my curved corners. So I'm going to bind it now, and then I'm going to show you it, and then I'm going to show you my sort of crazy quilting. I'm looking at it on the back. It's quite pretty. So anyway, I'm almost done my Bargello quilt, and I hope you guys will make one. It was fun. It was fun. So on to my binding, black and white stripe. I'm going to be binding my quilt. I'm not going to be doing a binding tutorial or anything. I'm just showing you what I do. If you haven't seen me do my binding, I put my binding, my 2.5 inch fold, or 2.25 inch, I should say, folded in half, my binding on the back of my quilt. And I machine everything, my hand stitching. I don't hand stitch anything. And I figure my machine stitching is far superior to my hand stitching. So I put it on the back of my quilt, and then I'll turn it over and I'll stitch it. Fairly neatly I can do this. But yeah, this is how I do it. I will start my binding about 18 inches down from the top corner and leave about a 6-inch tail. And then I'm not pulling, I'm just laying a 1/4 inch seam. And then, as you know, I round my corners. Is that on the, yeah, let me just move this over here. Yeah, I round my corners. So when it comes to it, about 6 inches or so up from the corner, as it were, 8 inches, I make this very, very, very loose. Almost, I mean, not like just holding it there, my hands are in the way, and just really making that loose, almost pushing it up without making tucks, almost pushing it up under the presser foot there. My hands are probably in the way, yeah. Anyway, I've done this before, and I'm making sure when I go around my round corner, just do little bites at a time to keep that 1/4 inch seam, to keep that 1/4 inch, I should say, away from the edge, because perhaps your inclination would sort of be to go, you know, keep this here, but then to go a bit wider into that binding. You mustn't do that. You must keep this nice and loose, lovely and loose, little tiny bits at a time. This is how I showed Jen as a beginner, and she got it. And this is instead of squaring off your corners. I just do a little tiny bit at a time, keeping that 1/4 inch, almost pushing it under the presser foot, almost, so it's so very, very loose. If you pull it around, which you could do, you could make that seam, you could make that curve. If you pulled it though, when you go to turn it, your corners are just going to curve up like a bowl. So this is the whole point of keeping this so loose, almost to the point where you make a tuck. You don't, and if you do make a tuck, it's fine, because you'll see what I mean. And again, I am sitting directly in front of the sewing machine. This is right here. How many times? How can I emphasize that? So I won't bore you, but I will show you. Let me see if that's in the frame. Yeah, I will show you that here's my corner. All right, and then there you go. Oops, bunch of threads. How beautifully it turns over. Look how beautifully that turns over. And then I'll go along and I will just stitch right along there, right around the curve. There's no tucks, there's no folds, there's no bowing, there's no cupping or anything. It just lays right there. If you just ease that and keep your 1/4 inch, then you stitch it right along there, keeping that the same exact way that you do your entire binding. So there is your corner. Simple, simple, simple. I'm just finishing up my binding here, and I'm turning it. I've stitched it to the back, and I'm turning it to the around. Let's see if that's, yeah, I'm turning it around. And people say, you know, with machine stitch bindings, you absolutely do see the stitching. Obviously you see the stitching. But once you perfect it, you can get pretty good at it. Sometimes I go off, I have to go a little back, but you can just get really nice and close. Now, Jen and I were having a laugh. I always use white thread. 99% of the time, I use white thread when I'm quilting. Isn't that funny? But and this is black and white. So you're thinking, oh, what color thread would you use? Gray? I use white, because I just too tend to think that when you use white thread on black fabric, in this case, this binding is black and white stripe, I think the white thread on the black looks a little bit better to my eye than the black thread on the white, which I think would tend to look, I've said it before, I think darker thread on a lighter fabric looks a bit spidery. And if you don't do it really well, you can really see it. Whereas the black, it sort of hides that. Somebody might have a completely different opinion than mine, but that's mine. So I'm using white thread. I've turned it around. Oh, it's interesting because somebody would say, "Oh, you use pretty soft pink and white roses, and then you put black and white," because the back is as important as the front. But what I see, is almost like this is like cotton candy at a circus, and this is the circus tent. I see summery, I see happy, I see pretty, I see not serious. Whereas, as I was saying, binding is so very important. I say I use stripe binding a lot. If a quilt is serious, like my, I just did my Victorian quilt. I put a dark green binding on it because it didn't lend itself, obviously, to this happy look. And even though, like I said, that's pink and white with red roses, I did a black and white binding. That's cool. I like it very much. So here I am. I'm just tucking this in. Let's see if that's in. Yeah, tucking this in. All my stuff. I'm stitching along. Now I'm coming to my corner. I hope it works. I hope it doesn't mess up. And what I do is I'm going to start turning this corner in. I'm going to turn this, let me see if I can, yeah. I'm going to turn this in and just let everything straight in front of me. Just tuck all that rubbish in, pull this out the whole time, pulling it out. And I'm going to stitch carefully. You can go slowly. Now, as you can see, my curve of my corner, I want to put it exactly like it will lay. Exactly like it will lay. I'm not pushing, I'm not pulling, I'm not tugging or anything. And the way I've stitched it, let me just see here. Yeah, there you go. It's exactly like it will lay. So I'm putting my fingers here. I'm pulling that out like this to the furthest it goes, and I'm just easing it. I'm easing it around, trying to keep this hand out of the way, but I really do need to use two hands. I'm just easing this around, taking little bites, maybe lifting up my presser foot slightly, keeping this, just little bites right around. Tiny my phone. Oh, it's just so funny. I do have to have my phone on because I always say about my silly phone, I have to have my phone on me at all times because Sometimes the school will call because of Maxwell, if he has had a problem. So I just have to, the school's only about 5 minutes from here if I have to go and collect Maxwell. So I do have to have my phone, but isn't that funny how it always, that was a text message. I know I'm receiving a text message. So anyway, here I'm coming around. Here's my corner. I'm not tugging, I'm not pulling anything. I'm pulling it here. I'm pulling it here to encapsulate all of that rubbish. And then I'll finish up. But then there is my corner. My lovely corner. And you can see the stitching. I always say that. Oh yeah, your machine's stitching it. Of course you can see the stitching on the back. But to my mind, it almost looks a little bit more professional. I quite like the look of machine stitching because it's machined. And it's not hand done, it's machine done. So I like the look that machine stitching, machine binding gives to a quilt. And as I said, there's no way I could ever do my hand sewing of my binding if I turned it to the front to the back as strong as my machine. I'm over at my ironing board and I just wanted to show you. I'm always saying that. I just wanted to show you. I just wanted to show you. Of course I want to show you. That's why you're tuning in, right? Here I am at my ironing board, and what am I doing? I'm gently, ever so gently ironing my quilt. Now, you might think, why the heck are you ironing your quilt? I'm not like ironing it like that. But I think, why am I ironing my quilt? I just think it becomes a lot nicer, that initial use or present that you're going to give. Just gently, I finished up my binding around the edges, my lovely curved corners. And obviously, with the batting, it's going to puff up. Obviously. It's going to puff up when you wash it, when you dry it, when you fluff it, when you wrap it around you. But until then, I think it's just a lovely thing to iron it just nice, just as you go along the binding. You've been messing about with this fabric for a while now, and it gets a little bit wrinkled, and I love the crispness that the final iron of a quilt gives. That's my little thing. Maybe a lot of people will disagree, but I just love it. I was showing Jen how to do that. I'm not like this, I'm holding this up. I'm just gliding on my hot iron, my hot dry iron. I never use steam, as you know. I just use my water. If I am going to do anything, I just use my spray bottle. Somebody says, why don't I use steam? Sometimes I feel steam can perhaps distort, especially a smaller block. But not, again, it's to each their own. I like to use water to add a little bit of crispness if I need it, or even a little bit of shrinkage if I need it. I don't pre-wash my fabrics, as you know, but if I do spritz it, just the act of the water and the heat will shrink the fabric. So I don't have a tremendous amount of shrinkage in my quilts once they're washed. I think because I use a hot dry iron and water when I'm constructing my blocks. But that's how I do it. So I'll finish ironing this up and I'll show you my pretty finished Bargello quilt.